Hi folks, I'm Colin Munro of Colin Munro Photography. Welcome. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the fundamentals of photography and how to get your camera off auto settings. Now, for most of us, when we buy our new digital SLR or mirrorless camera, if we're relatively new to photography, it's quite a daunting experience. You look at it and it's just this mass of buttons and dials and menus and submenus. Where do you start? So what a lot of us end up doing is we simply leave it on auto and let the camera make the decision. That's cool. 90% of the time you're going to get a pretty good photograph, because modern cameras are clever, they are sophisticated. Problem is, what do you do for the 10% where you don't get the photograph you want? How do you change it if you don't understand what's happening, if you don't understand what the buttons do? How do you know which way you need to alter it in order to get the image that you want? Secondly, just pressing a button is not terribly satisfying. It's not very creative. If that's why we get into photography, we don't just simply want to record things, we want to be creative, then that doesn't really cut it. It's not like producing a painting. You wouldn't press a button and a painting and say, I made this painting. And it's a similar way with photography. We want to feel that we're actually creating something, and in order to do that, we have to understand the process and be in control of the process. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to try and simplify, break down to the very fundamentals and give you a feel for it. And if you're interested in learning more, then I offer one-to-one sessions. You can find those on my website, and I offer training courses and workshops also. Again, you'll find information about those on my website. But let's make a start here. So fundamentally, every camera, whether it's modern digital SLR, it's a mirrorless camera, or it's a 70-year-old film camera, is essentially just a light tight box with a hole at one end that allows light to pass through, and some light sensitive material at the far end. Of course, in the old days, that light sensitive material was film, and the light hitting the film photochemically changed it to begin the process of creating our image. Nowadays we're in the digital age, but the principle is pretty much the same. Instead of film, we have a sensor, and the light hitting the sensor is converted into electrical charge, and again this begins the process of starting to create an image. So we have our sensor, and the hole at the far end is called the aperture. And this is essentially what a camera is. If you think of, for instance, a pinhole camera, that's really all a pinhole camera is. But in order to create our image, we have to have the light correctly exposed, and we have to have it in focus. So I'm going to leave aside focus and talk about that a little bit later. But if we think of exposure is related to the amount of light that hits the sensor. The more light that hits the sensor, the greater the exposure. The less light, the less the exposure. So we talk about an image being correctly exposed, overexposed, or underexposed. By overexposed, we mean it becomes so bright that we lose all the detail in the highlights. Or by underexposed, we mean it becomes so dark that we start to lose all the detail in the shadows. So we want our image to be correctly exposed, and in order to do that, we have to control the amount of light that's hitting the sensor. And we do that in two ways. Firstly, we can make the aperture larger or smaller. Obviously, the larger the aperture is, the more light that will hit the sensor in any given time period. And secondly, we can limit the duration that light is hitting the sensor. And we do this by means of a mechanism known as the shutter. So essentially, the shutter consists of two blades that come together in front of the sensor, blocking off the light. Now, nowadays there are also electronic shutters, but I'm not going to complicate the issue by talking about them at the moment. The principle of what the principal mechanism is very different, but what they actually achieve is fundamentally the same. So we'll think of mechanical shutters because they're easier to visualize. So they close in front of the sensor, blocking off light. And then when our finger comes down to press the shutter release button, the shutter opens for a predetermined period of time. The light is allowed to pass through, hit the sensor, then the shutter blades close again and the light is stopped. And that essentially is how we control the exposure of our photographic image. If you enjoyed this, found it useful, and would like to learn more about the tuition I offer, the workshops, the courses, the one-to-one tuition, then have a look at my website, www.colinmunrophotography.com.